Did you know that on this date in 1876, the very first telephone call was made by Alexander Graham Bell to Thomas Watson? We've come a long way, baby. It sounds like a very long time ago, but in our present society of speed, 141 years is a blink. And just for you, Dilly, lover of numbers, that was only 72,109,600 minutes ago. I think that fits in very well with the cause and effect of what that brought about with our cell phones and all the other technology that goes with it today. And I'm going to get right into our subject, which is the principle of cause and effect. It is also known as the less compelling principle of reaping what you sow, of which humanity has apparently long forgotten for the inconvenience of responsibility it required. May the seriousness of our present crisis be brought into full focus once again through this insightful explanation coming up this program. Alan Hopking, ageless wisdom teacher and author of Esoteric Healing, states in his book that identifying with thoughts, feelings, or acting in such a way that is not in line with or losing the awareness and presence of one's true inner purpose, the life purpose of our original intention, is called being fractured. These fractures can be tiny and huge. They can be known and unknown. Fractures are the means of developing and progressing evolutionary change and achievement. The fractures themselves enjoy being overcome because to them they can then enter their own world as much as the light forces which overcame the fracture enters the light world of freedom. It is a dual bonus each time. We do it in our own lives from minute to minute, indeed second to second. It hinges on our will, supported by our love and intelligence. This is the way of evolution, transformation, revelation, and enlightenment. When it's pointed out that the principle of cause and effect, rightly understood and rightly wielded, can bring that which produces happiness, good, and freedom from pain more easily than it brings pain with its chain of consequences, do you feel able to grasp the significance? The principle of cause and effect is not the principle of retribution, as one would surmise as one reads the current books upon the subject. Retribution is but one aspect of the working of the principle of cause and effect. Men interpret these dimly sensed principles in terms of finality, and from their little point of view, the idea of retribution runs through much of the teaching on karma, for instance, because men seek a plausible explanation of things as they appear to be, and are themselves fond of dealing out retribution. Yet there is far more general good karma than bad, little as you may think it when immersed in such a period as the present. Viveka states we are perpetually immersed in good, call it karmic or not, because that was the divine intention from the beginning. All through the steps of creation in the book of Genesis, each was ended with, "and it was good," and culminating the end in Genesis 1:31 as God looked over it all and exclaimed, "It was very good." We are so accustomed to the atmosphere of good that we don't recognize it until some form of bad atmosphere pierces the reverie. And most of that bad atmosphere was invited in by our own selves as we occupied in that state of expectancy. Written, we are told, it must be understood that people try to forget grievous examples. The destruction of entire continents is cautiously excluded from the old writings. Equally well concealed are many indications of the events determining world destiny. We do not like to torture ourselves, say the custodians of mankind, and they are ready to hide from themselves bankruptcy and their defeat. but it is known the absurdity of attempted hiding what exists. The examples of the past will teach caution. The principle of cause and effect is today a great and incontrovertible fact in the consciousness of humanity everywhere. They may not call it by that name, but they are well aware that in today's events, the nations are reaping what they sowed. This great principle, at one time a theory, is now a proven fact and a recognized factor in human thinking. The frequently asked question, why, brings in the factor of cause and effect with constant inevitability. The concepts of heredity and of environment are efforts to explain existing human conditions, qualities, racial characteristics, national temperaments and ideals prove the fact of some initiating world of causes. Historical conditions, the relationships between nations, social taboos, religious convictions and tendencies can all be traced to originating causes, some of them most ancient. Everything that is happening in the world today and which is so potently affecting humanity, things of beauty and of horror, modes of living and civilization and culture, prejudices and likings, scientific attainment and artistic expression, and the many ways in which humanity throughout the planet colors existence, are aspects of effects initiated somewhere on some level at some time by human beings, both individually and en masse. Karma, cause and effect, sow and reap, is therefore that which man has instituted, carried forward, endorsed, omitted to do, or has done right through the ages until the present moment. Today the harvest is ripe, and mankind is reaping what it has sown, preparatory to a fresh plowing in the springtime of the new age, with a fresh sowing of seed, which will, let us pray and hope, produce a better harvest. Here are examples of this principle at work so that we can see the causes of our spiritual crisis as provided by the coming Christ. It is vital, so I will quote it. One of the coming Christ's primary concerns is to illuminate the nature of the spiritual crisis of our time. But we cannot understand this spiritual crisis, he says, without a clear consideration of the underlying causes and their effects. The principle of cause and effect can be understood as a major expression of spiritual principle, and to the extent that we learn to recognize and apply this principle, spiritual principle is illuminated for us. It is important in this regard to train oneself to perceive patterns. When, for example, a civilian airliner is shot down, it will be found that for no obvious reason, one or two other planes are lost. This constitutes a pattern. Nature, like the rest of creation, is composed of atoms. Since man-made items, such as airplanes, are equally composed of atoms, when these patterns are interfered with, crashes are inevitable. Similarly, there are patterns in nature that must be respected. If you disturb these patterns, the elements of nature, the weather cycles, and human beings themselves become disturbed. Spiritual bankruptcy creates the suffering of disease in the world, while physical disasters such as earthquakes, explosions, and murder come about because of ill health on the mental plane. Life consists of the mind, spirit, and body. If the natural evolution of these bodies is retarded or hampered by man-made principles, there are always disastrous consequences. If the physical body is starved, it weakens and becomes sick. If the spiritual body is starved, a person fades and dies. If the mental body is starved, a person loses his direction in life. People whose balance in mind, spirit, and body is fragile can be tipped over the edge by the disturbance of atomic patterns. Motiveless murders are the result. One of the primary causes of our spiritual crisis, Christ teaches, is complacency, the root of all evil in the world. Wherever there is complacency, he says, there is the seed of corruption, chaos, confusion, and ultimate destruction. Complacency is not outside us, but inside, a mentality that can be summed up as, I'm all right, Jack. This mentality leads both individuals and institutions to become estranged and disconnected from the realities of life. In this condition, one has no vision and can only produce ineffective solutions. When people move in this mental atmosphere of complacency, they are essentially cut off from their real selves and fall into a monotonous routine, the same old thing day in and day out. Life is movement, but complacent people are, in effect, in an arrested condition. The mind, therefore, seeks new peaks of experience, which can and often does lead to a variety of forms of corruption and perversion. Thus, complacency is ultimately self-destructive, and whole societies can be destroyed by it. The following are some examples of how human beings have set in motion energies which, under the principle of cause and effect, have generated the social, political, and economic effects causing so much destruction today. Commercialization and market forces. In the last few years, we've seen a reduction in the wars and conflicts taking place throughout the world as the superpowers have withdrawn from their policy of supplying arms to further their own foreign arms and interests. Gratefully, the energy which drives soldiers into battles and fills the air with warplanes has been switched off. But we are also informed that energy cannot just disappear. It has to go somewhere. This energy has been roaming the world, and suddenly it has found a new womb. The commercialization created by market forces and comparison. Freedom is not found in the free play of market forces, for market forces have no eyes. They are blind and therefore satanic, leading inevitably to mine and more, that is, to possessiveness and greed without end. Market forces will bring this civilization, as we have known it, to the edge of disaster. Market forces have created social and natural havoc. People have been condemned to death literally in the name of profit and loss. Hospitals have been shut because they are not profitable. Schools have difficulty staying open. These institutions are essential for the health and well-being of society. The new creed of superpowers has become the economy, which is the very soul of commercialization. This represents a serious new threat to the world, one that could even compromise human life. Commercialization is more destructive than any nuclear bomb. The quality of commercialization is greed, and, in the coming Christ's view, commercialization means making money while others starve. It will affect all nations, he says. This negative energy, which recoiled from the battlefield, will create a very hostile world. It is the human mind which has created this force, and it can be changed by the same, by human awareness. Only the coming Christ, however, has the power to turn this destructive energy into a creative force. Commercialization throughout the world is part of the pattern that will result in a major collapse of the world's stock markets, beginning in Japan. After this crash, the first duty of governments will be to feed people with the right food. Their second duty will be to ensure adequate housing. Next will come health and education, and lastly, defense. In short, the crash will lead to a reordering of priorities. Already there are many strikes taking place as people begin to question the boss-employee relationship. This is because the new energy is already diluting and sweeping away the master-servant relationship which underlies so much of market forces. You can only solve the problems of the world with a sense of realism that is not clouded by ideology or market forces. Politicians whose creed is market forces will find that their time is over. Capitalism in its pure form is at an end in Europe. It has no future whatsoever. Instead, countries will model their government on a form of democratic socialism. Gradually, this will become the model for all nations as the most effective way to ensure that the voice and will of the people is properly represented. In the new systems, even market forces will be based on social consciousness. Market forces will not be in charge of social consciousness. It is social consciousness which will guide market forces. And then he speaks on crime and violence. Society as a whole is attempting to emerge from its bondage, and the eruption of crime, corruption, drugs, and violence are the inevitable prelude. Society as a whole is attempting to emerge from its bondage, and the eruption of crime, corruption, drugs, and violence are the inevitable prelude. In the case of violent crime, the self realizes it is imprisoned in the web of the mind to such an extent that there is no purpose left in life. The vibrations of mind, spirit, and body are disturbed, and crimes are committed. The self is not the perpetrator of these crimes. The perpetrator is the confused mind which has taken over the self. Take, for example, child abuse. In many cases, a single powerful thought has taken hold of the mind to the exclusion of all else. This is destructive. In order to help the person to detach himself from that thought, it is necessary to lead him to an awareness of the self, the observer, the watcher. The self is not the mind. This will create a space inside the person and will enable him to free himself. There are no shortcuts to this process, but it is itself part of a method which also includes beneficial breathing technique. There is training of certain people who are fitted for this type of work, and appropriate training will yield results. In addition, harmless drugs will be found which will help to calm the nerves. It is in cities that crime combustion occurs, where people are addicted to drugs, sexual violence, murder, and other crimes. This process of combustion brings the dirt up to the surface. Neither the police nor the military, however, will be able adequately to control the outbreak of crime now occurring. At the moment, prison is the only alternative for violent and dangerous criminals. But violence cannot be cured by sentencing people to prison. Moreover, the coming Christ points out, not all people are in prison for violent crimes. Many who are in prison are not even criminals. As for the drug epidemic, the politicians' contribution to the problem of drug addiction consists of television advertisements to curb drug abuse. But the politicians alone are to blame for the desperation of these people. If people are so straitened in life that they cannot even eat properly, they will lead desperate lives. They will sell their bodies, steal, and end up in prison. If you deprive people of any future in life, deprive them of nourishment, they will end up on drugs to help them forget their desperation. And from drugs, it is not far to crime and even murder. The massive threat posed by drugs cannot be solved through the fear of the principal. Strong policing will be needed to crack down on the organized gangs of drug producers, but it is not the answer to the individual drug user. Drug addicts are suffering from spiritual starvation, from extreme self-alienation. life becomes purposeless and people want to bring their lives to an end, and so they commit slow suicide via drugs. LadyJaye wants to insert a statement here to let it be known that ageless wisdom teaches that the one who commits suicide only solidifies their existence on another plane in the same agonizing darkness from which they attempted to escape, until the time of their natural death passes and they will be freed to continue on the soul perfection journey. Christ continues, if life has no meaning, then meaning is what must be restored. And for this to occur, it is necessary for the person to experience himself differently, to experience a sense of his own worth. Once that happens, he can grow in self-awareness. How can this be achieved? Not through the fear of principles or by preaching ideology, not by restricting people's movements or by extra police or more prison cells. The only answer, the coming Christ states, is developing detachment in mind, spirit, and body. You must become free from any ism, for that is the deadliest drug. This can only happen when the self is given self-respect. It is like a sponge. It absorbs illusions like water and engulfs the self. When helping drug addicts, it is no use telling them not to take drugs or sending the police to arrest them. The only way to transform their lives is by teaching them, be what you are. They should be taught to practice detachment even while they are still taking drugs. The next time they take drugs, they will find themselves a little reluctant about continuing their habit until eventually they will realize that it is the body that is being injected with drugs and not the self. Through awareness and then detachment, habits of all kinds will fall away like leaves in the autumn. The power of the environment should also be used to create self-awareness. When an individual enters a church, he feels peaceful and tranquil. The self experiences this, and the mind is no longer in confusion or turmoil. Living in the bleak, depressing conditions of a run-down council estate, a person's mind will be desperate and reach for drugs to find escape. That is why the environment should be a high priority among the country's leaders. Clean your environment and your life will respond to it, he says. If there is no stress or strain in your surroundings, then there is no need for drugs, for within the human body is the most powerful drug known to humanity. Detachment. A note here, detachment means simply to preserve ever the attitude of the onlooker in the head. Thus, the detachment of the soul will grow, while the attachment of the soul to souls will grow and increase. There is a link in this text on my website, amritanicolemarketing.com, that you will find for more information on detachment. It continues, an energy has been released in the world which counteracts negative forces. Eventually, certain judicial reforms will take place, and minor or petty crimes will not lead to prison sentences. When world tension begins to decrease, when the principle of sharing begins to be implemented through a variety of social, economic, and political reforms, people will feel less threatened, and there will be less and less crime. Again, in this text on my website, you will find a link for more on this topic. I send you off to a sublime weekend with this prayer from LadyJaye. May we each recognize, acknowledge, and strive to perfect in our lives, individually and corporately, those principles and precepts of the ageless wisdom, those living ethics of the Agni Yoga. Guide us into our new nature of serving perfectly, daily teaching through right action and reaction, with no thought of ourselves or concern for the future.